Right back, guys.
Welcome to the Essential Libertarians, giving you the tools for self-governance. Today we have an awesome discussion. We have an anarcho pluralist panelist today, and we're going to really break it down. We have Jeremiah from Anarch Unity. Go check us out there. We're going to write some more articles. We're going to be breaking some down. He's also from AgNext and the Free Thought Project. And we have returning Keith Preston. He wrote an amazing book, probably one of the best ones on anarchy, Failures of Anarchism. And you can find him at Attack the System. One of the best, if not the best, contemporary American thinkers on all forms of anarchy and hyphenated anarchy. What's up, guys?
Hello. Not much. How you?
Good. So I'll make my point that I was trying to make, which is this. Instead of with what's going on in respect to Texas, my thought is this. If you're going to get anarchy, first, I would prefer you start breaking up the union. Once you break up individual states, then you can say, okay, well, in this pocket of the state, we want to do a Murray Rothbard type society. This pocket, maybe there's some people, we want to do a Kropotkin, Bakunin type society, syndicalist, whatever it is. And then that's how you break it down. And I agree with Keith, we should go to the local level. And if someone believes in Stirner or Tucker very, very strongly, fine, be an individualist and go off and do your own thing. But I do think it has to be gradual with state secession. And I do think certain states will work together. And that's just kind of how it will be. Now, you asked me in respect to BRICS. Here's the reason I don't like BRICS or NATO is because I could see potential global conflict happening between NATO and BRICS, and those are global powers. And I don't know if BRICS has anything like Article 2012 or whatever it is when they get attacked, everybody has to pitch in. But I imagine that they probably would. So in respect to having effective decentralization, I think this is like secession and state secession is probably the best first step. I can't think of another best.
No. The best first step is spreading the philosophy. And the reason it's spreading the philosophy is right now, the reason Texas is angry is because Biden is telling them that their government will lose federal funding. Will lose federal funding and support if their government fucking doesn't stop putting razor wire in the water and pushing families into it. That's why Texas is mad. They're saying it's self-defense to put razor wire in the water. That was in the fucking letters. It's the same shit that the CSA tried to pull when they tried to say that, no, it's not really about slavery, but every single letter that stated their intention and reasons included slavery. Every single one of them. Not one of them didn't include that. So when you talk about this shit, and you have these states, which are states, not anarchist places, which do not have anarchy mentalities, which break off from the union, you know what that's going to result in? It's going to result in those societies which already aren't anarchist not being anarchist. And those societies will not become more anarchy capable if they're split off from the union and allowed to do whatever they want, including putting razor wire in the water and then pushing families into it. So let me be super clear here and say that, like, that is not the solution. The first step is not for Texas
Can you read that?
and then get away with whatever they want. That's not the first step. The first step is for people to recognize on such a broad-based level that we need a better world. Not the one that these people built, not the one that these people currently control, because otherwise we aren't even going to have anarchy as a possibility. And then we need to have these people interconnected enough once they do have that mentality that they are able to stand up to the NATOs, the BRICS, the whatever else. Those people otherwise will get fucking crushed.
Okay, so let's talk about. Let me break down those points one by one. It's kind of like the agorist libertarian argument when people like freak out because I said I want to vote for Joshua Smith, and I'm somehow perpetuating Biden and Trump by Orange Man and whoever else by doing that, or even if I vote for Cornel West or Jill Stein or whoever. My position is this: okay, spread the philosophy, but also take some kind of political action for decentralization. That means, yes, local municipalities or whatever you want to call them, towns breaking off, or towns saying, I'm not going to follow X or the state, and then states also saying they're going to defy the federal government. Personally, I don't like the way that they're handling immigration. I think it's a good idea that what we could do, and okay, to preface this, I like all my anarcho-syndicalist friends. I like all my ANCOM friends. I don't agree with his stance on, on like other social issues, if we can call it that. But I think an invitation-only immigration system like HOPA proposed would probably be the best thing, because America has some serious problems. Hawaii still needs rebuilding. Michigan, no.
No, Hoppe wants to crush the anti-fascist mob.
No, okay,
Fuck
listen.
Hoppe.
Okay, then forget Hoppe. But let's just go. What if we just said it's invitation? Like, say you want
Who gets
someone
to dole out the invitation? Who controls the
individual
property? Who controls the nation?
Okay, but wait, who doles it is just like this. If I knocked on your door and you said, like, from it taking this from Idiocracy, go away, I'm watching TV or something, or I'm trying to beat Sonic 2 because it's super hard to beat.
I know what you're saying, but a house isn't a country, and Texas doesn't have the same principles at play as a house.
Yeah, but you would argue, and you argued to me, you argued to me that government borders aren't real. Fine.
No, borders aren't real. They're interstitial territories between states. That's what they've always been.
But property is real.
But property lines are not borders. They aren't interstitial.
Okay, but like if I went to Anarchy House and let's say I was mean to BT, you tell me to leave, right? So
that's not a border.
It kind of is.
It's not.
That's why I mean invitation only. If you have a company, if you have something, if you're married to someone or you have a relationship, yeah, invite them over.
That's not what immigration is. I'm not immigrating to some place because I come into a house.
But that's how you get That's how you get.
Let me sign my visa. I've got to get into Best Buy. That's not how this works.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying
is not invitation-only immigration, yo. I don't know what the problem is.
If Best Buy extended employment to you, then you could.
No, it's not about visas. It's not about immigration. It's not about I'm a Best Buy citizen.
I didn't say you're a Best Buy citizen. I said if you got a job at Best Buy, you could come over. If they invited you, why is that bad?
Because you said immigration, and we're talking about nations, and we're talking about segregation, and it's not this. You're moving the goalposts.
Whatever you want to call it. People coming over from one country. If I invite a dude from Honduras to work for me, they can come over. If I don't.
And so if they don't get an invitation from somebody in the country, they shouldn't be like, fucking able to travel into here. There's no way for the common person to migrate to where they need to be and then start working there. Let me explain to you from my own personal experience why that's trash. Because in Spokane, I've tried to get people to move up here. People will not give them a place to stay unless they have a job here already. And people will not give them a job here until they have a place to stay. It doesn't even work like that in practice, much less in fucking theory.
Well, that's an issue of that particular in Spokane. I can't.
No, it's an issue of it everywhere, man. It's not that simple.
Well, if I'm going to somewhere, like say I go to somewhere, I have no hotel reservation, I have nowhere to stay, and I have no job, and to stay, not to vacation there. That's not praxeological. And yeah, I'm being a little bit
praxeological. What?
Well,
it's literally how this country got fucking founded, is people coming from a place that they weren't, staying here without any real plans, and then staking their own way. And then westward expansion was just those people moving west into further territory that they did not at the time control until they moved there and then controlled it. What the fuck are you talking about?
Okay, so let's break that down. With Manifest Destiny, I agree with the cowboys and stuff. That was more discovering frontiers that were not occupied. And for the record, they did quite well. Red Dead Redemption is fiction. There was only about 8 bank robberies that I can calculate in the so-called Wild Wild West. The Wild Wild West is a myth. So I agree there. But right now, it's a different set of circumstances. I'd say they're...
Why?
Because we have serious internal problems.
We didn't always have serious internal problems?
No.
When did we not? The Whiskey Rebellion was crushed by George Washington and 13,000 other dudes.
We didn't have serious problems, in my opinion, 1960s, 70s.
What?
Also, my co-host is here. Hello, Danny. But here's the thing. I think why is it bad to want to solve your own issues? Solve, say, Flint, Michigan, East Palestine.
Flint, Michigan ain't my issue. East Palestine ain't my issue. I'm in Spokane.
Okay,
If
fine.
you want to decentralize, then we have to not say that Spokane is your issue.
I'm not saying personally. I'm saying people fix their own issues in their state and then allow more people to come by invitation.
Okay, why should they be able to decide to invite or not invite people?
Because it's their property. It's either
not their property, it's a state.
Or an employer. But to come to that state, you would have to go to someone's property or have an ability to stay there. Like,
why?
Because otherwise, why are you going other than being a tourist, which is fine, but I don't have an issue with that.
Okay, so you're fine with tourism, but you're not fine with somebody, for instance, coming here, seeing whether or not they like it, and then deciding whether or not they want to maybe set up camp here and start their own business.
They can, but it's extremely dangerous, and then you have the problem you have now. There's not enough resources to compensate. Have you seen
there are enough resources.
Have you seen the gumball?
And central controlled by the state, yo.
Have you seen the gumball thingy? The gumball analysis?
I don't care about it, but like I'm not familiar with it. What do you mean there aren't enough resources? Like, are you doing the overpopulation thing, or are you doing the replacement?
I'm not a Malthusian. Look, resources is in, it doesn't, from what's going on, we can't help everybody coming over here. It doesn't seem, it's not good. And people are dying across the thing. It's not.
And why are they coming here? Because of what the states did.
Because of what the state did during Smedley Butler. He talked about it, the Dole Fruit Company and all that stuff. Yes.
And further on, for decades, there have always been internal and external problems. So what the fuck are you talking about?
I agree with Keith. I'm more of a blame the federal government, not America, obviously, because there's a lot of good Americans, blaming the federal government first for imperialism that causes problems.
Dole Fruit Company was not an empire state. It was a corporation. And all of these people, Texaco, all of these people are complicit in the spreading of global terror that has routinely fucked these places over and still does. And currently in Argentina, the U.S. is building a vassal state with Javier Milei's help. So currently we're dealing with the help of Javier Milei. They're going to dollarize that economy. And he already said to the WEF, y'all are the real heroes and I'm with you until the end. He said that at the end of the speech at the WEF that everybody's jacking off about. So like he's like a perfect example of this. He's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, and the fact that the US is creating these problems everywhere it can, and that its Western allies are helping them create the problems everywhere they can. And these people are coming from regions that they destabilized. And if there aren't enough resources here, it's because there weren't enough resources there. And these people are coming to a place where the resources have been being moved. So if there aren't enough resources here, then the U.S. needs to do a damn sight better job of getting those resources, or they need to stop fucking other places up. It has nothing to do with borders.
I agree. That part I agree with you. That we need to stop intervening completely. But how do you stop intervening completely? You break states up, and then when states are separate, like Arizona is its own state, they're like, do you want to go to war? No. Do you want to give money to Israel? No. Do you want to give money to Ukraine? No. We're our own country now. Oh, and then other countries are forming inside. Agoristan, Anarcho-Monarchistan, because I was reading about it recently. It doesn't actually seem to be that bad. It's not a meme ideology, actually. So as your king, that I declared myself to be because I'm a cool guy, I would say let states break up, let municipalities break up and do their own thing and experiment with that and see how it works.
Why do you hate BRICS and NATO so much if they are so ineffective at conquering nations that you could make things this vulnerable this quickly and still have like these nations with their like total sovereignty and independence? If George Washington could crush a small rebellion with 13,000 dudes, what do you think BRICS could do if countries that they have been wanting to fuck up in retaliation for a while of imperialism and etc. were suddenly smaller and more weak?
First,
We need
okay,
global anarchy.
I'll answer this question. All right. Currently, the Viet Cong beat America. There's a power separation there. We lost in Afghanistan. If we're really going to, things, the Saudis could not win in Yemen. And it does not seem, even though there's a very high civilian death toll in Gaza, that it does not seem, even with all of their Merkava tanks and billions of dollars, that the IDF is really doing well against Hamas. Now,
so because a huge amount of
my
civilians
argument is
have
this:
died,
we have Antifa,
we
we have Antifa, we have the Sons of Liberty, we have the boot. I'm not afraid of Putin. I'm not afraid of Xi. And we have American hunters. They get messed up so bad just from people in Texas and Pennsylvania. China could not beat Texas and Pennsylvania. They couldn't.
Maybe. But either way, what I can tell you is if these people truly are at threat of any sort of attack, even if they could withstand it with a huge amount of civilian death, might I add, if these people really are okay with that, which they're not, otherwise they would have already been okay with civil war, then these people would have already broken off. They would have already seceded, but they didn't because they value the fake safety that they get from these political alliances, and they value the fake feeling of security that they get from their local organizations, their fucking HOAs, their fucking like trite little bullshit communities. They're already okay with this, and we need to supplant that culture. We need to get a better philosophical grounding, or we are fucked. Okay. We need to start there before any secessions happen. Don't hope Texas secedes from the Union so that they can continue to put razor wire in families' waters. That isn't helping anybody. The only thing that it does would make Texas a uniparty fascist state at this rate. They are already massively red, massively state capitalist, massively invested in the system. They're already a part of their own problem. And the only thing that immediate secession without a cultural transfer would achieve is a fucked worse, much like more fascist, much more controlled Texas that was worse for everybody you claim to care about.
Okay. I disagree, but I want to hear Keith.
Why is the foundation of philosophy suddenly going to magically fucking shift overnight because they have all the power now and don't have to ask Daddy Fed? No, it's not. The fuck are you talking about, Kareem?
No, I'm saying it will set a trend that other states will say, "Oh, I can leave.
I can leave and be just as totalitarian as they are and get away with it."
No.
Yeah. Because they're not totalitarian yet. We have to fix that first.
Well, we have a lot of historical experience with some of these questions. There's a lot of interesting past events we could draw on to get some idea of how this works out. I would agree ultimately with what Jeremiah is saying, that to have a long-term, large-scale, enduring political change, there has to be a psychic sea change in the way people think, in the terms of you have to essentially create a new ideological or philosophical or cultural paradigm, and it has to be one that's capable of upholding whatever kind of goals you're trying to achieve. You're not going to get anarchy out of Saudi Arabia overnight when the Wahhabist religious faith is the dominant way of thinking among so many people there. That there are plenty of other places we could apply that to. So I do think that's the case. Now, as far as the issue of secession versus supranational states and small states and that kind of thing, you can approach that from a lot of different angles. I do think that in the United States, the only way somewhere like Texas is going to become independent is if the United States itself collapses. I don't really see a massive superstate like the United States allowing one of its constituent units to simply leave. That would be like saying that some of the former Soviet republics should have been able to leave during the Cold War. Well, I mean, some of the Soviet vassal states in Eastern Europe actually tried that, and they sent in tanks and crushed them. So what happened there was the Soviet state itself had to collapse, and then out of that came about, well, between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of Yugoslavia, that whole communist Eurasian expanse, out of that we got about 30 new countries. So that was a massive pan-secession. This concept I've written about in the past, pan-secessionism, that was a massive pan-secession. Now, the results of it were mixed. On one hand, some of the Western or some of the Eastern European countries, west of the Soviet Union, those probably did improve considerably in many ways in the post-communist era. I'd rather live in Romania as it is today than live under Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania, for example. Also, there were negatives as well, though. In the former Yugoslavia, you actually had a civil war with ethnic cleansing and genocide and that kind of thing in parts of the former Yugoslavia. You've also had a situation where Russia, the Russian nation itself, which was the mother country of the Soviet Union, they've also been, as we've seen, aggressive towards surrounding states. Ukraine isn't the one that we're thinking about now, but they've also done that in Georgia, and they've tried to dominate and manipulate the politics of the Central Asian countries like Turkmenistan and places like that. Also, you have provinces within Russia itself that are still very much under Russian domination, but are culturally different. Like Chechnya is probably one of the best examples. Russian history is actually very similar to American history in the sense that American history, you have this Anglo-Saxon dominant ethnic group historically that based in the Northeast that expanded outward and conquered all these other people and created this kind of imperium. And with Russia, it's the ethnic Muscovites, the people from the region where Moscow is now, and they're like the Anglo-Saxons of Russia. But the collapse of the Soviet Union was a mixed bag. In some ways it was produced better results. In some ways it produced worse results. Like during the Yeltsin years, for example, the average life expectancy dropped by about 20 years from what it had been during the late Soviet era. So they had massive economic problems in Russia itself that were worse than what they had in the Soviet era. And then you had the ethnic civil war in Yugoslavia. Those were probably the two worst things. You've had other things as well that were highly negative. You've also had, though, historically other examples of smaller secessions where like smaller states break away in a way that's relatively peaceful. Like Sweden and Norway used to be one country. They separated into two separate countries. More recently, Czechoslovakia was split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So it's possible to have secession in ways that don't create civil war, don't necessarily create a worse system than the one you had. And a positive argument in favor of secessionism is that smaller, more localized systems of government can be easier to evade or control or contain. Years ago, Kirkpatrick Sale, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's an anarchist he's sort of a green anarchist type. He used to hold conferences for secession groups in the United States back in the late 2000s. I went to one of them, but Kirkpatrick Sale had a book back in 1980 called Human Scale, where he was an anarchist theorist. And he pointed out that one of the advantages of having relatively small countries is that it's unlikely that, say, Ohio would go and fight the Vietnam War in the same way that the United States did during that time period. So there are advantages to secession by smaller groups from larger groups. There are negatives as well, but there are positives. There are positives to smaller states. They're easier to evade. They're easier to contain. They generally don't amass nuclear weapons and things like that. A downside is smaller states can be dominated geopolitically by larger states if they're weaker states. I mean, a good example there is the relationship between the United States and the rest of the Western Hemisphere. Historically, I gave the example of Russia and the Central Asian, Caucasian countries, China and the surrounding countries there in East Asia. That's an issue. Turkey and then its relationship to the Kurdish territories and Western Syria and all of that. So there's plenty of issues there. As far as secession, it's also true that you may have people who want to secede in a way that they have a very authoritarian ideology that they want to be the dominant ideological paradigm in whatever secessionist paradigm they have. So
crush the anti-fascist mob.
Right. Well, one issue would be, Texas is a good example. I mean, if Texas became an independent country today, it wouldn't be any kind of anarchism, much less libertarianism, much less left libertarianism. I mean, an independent Texas would probably be about like Saudi Arabia. It would be an oil-rich country on a Gulf, located on a Gulf, only the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Persian Gulf. And it would be a quasi-theocracy, only a Christian one rather than an Islamic one. Now, you could still make the argument that that's an acceptable cause for breaking up the United States as a whole, and then if you look at all the negatives the United States do around the world. For example, when we talk about the immigration issue, I have a book I wrote about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I guess, called El Salvador War by Proxy, and it's about the civil war in El Salvador in the 1980s, where there was a civil war between the government and then various rebel groups, and the United States was backing the Salvadoran government, and basically they destroyed the country of El Salvador. I mean, and this happened not just in El Salvador, but it also happened in Nicaragua and Guatemala and Honduras during the same period, where the United States, through their support of terrorist groups and state terrorism in Latin America, laid waste to entire countries. And that is one of the primary reasons why we have the immigration problems we have now, because a lot of those people are coming from places like Guatemala. I mean, most of the illegal immigrants in the United States are not from Mexico proper. They're from the Central America. Yeah, Central America, and then the actual South American countries. And as far as even when it comes to immigration from Mexico, the impact of NAFTA back in the early 90s destroyed
and
Mexican agriculture. Yeah. Well, all those international trade treaties collectively.
Yeah.
But that started pushing a lot of Mexican people, Mexican farmers across the border looking for work as migrant laborers because Mexican agriculture was destroyed. And the same was true in the Middle East. Like one reason why the population of Middle Eastern people in the United States has grown in recent decades is we have more refugees coming from the Middle East due to the wars in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen and many other places. So if you don't
Somalia.
Somalia, absolutely, yeah, Sudan. Well, I mean, even going back to the late 1970s, I remember in the late 1970s we had an immigration crisis in the United States with people that were called at the time the boat people. And these were people from Southeast Asian countries that literally would get on makeshift boats and sail across the Pacific and sail up to the California coast. And where were these people coming from? They were coming from Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Places that the United States laid waste to during the Vietnam War. So it was really just a prelude to the immigration crisis from Central America. So the impact of the United States on worldwide has the effect of significantly increasing the migration rates, or at least the number of people who want to come to the United States because they're trying to escape terrible conditions that are in part exacerbated by the American policy towards those particular countries. So that's an issue there. So I think until somebody addresses that issue, I think you're always going to see lots of people trying to come to the United States to seek asylum or seek a refugee status or something like that. Now, it's also true you have a lot of economic migrants. Now, that may change as the value of the U.S. dollar declines worldwide, because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. The U.S. dollar is worth a lot of money internationally. So people like to make American money. So that's another reason why people come here. Again, that may change if the American dollar declines. But so that's another reason for migration. As far as the one thing that's interesting is the debates that different types of libertarians and anarchists have over the immigration question, because many, of course, have the view, well, of course, we should have open borders and open immigration because, after all, borders are artificial, and borders aren't just lines on a map that somebody drew, and usually and most borders are based on conquest. Ultimately, if you look at where most countries came from, when somebody conquered somebody and said, "This is mine."
Bordere, it's literally a war term. It's like the edge of a shield.
Well, some, of course, some people on the left, on the further left, and with valid reason, say that, well, really, the whole United States rightfully should belong to the Native American nations, and that's a valid point. I mean, you could argue that that's really the case. On the other hand, you could turn that around and say, well, there are potential dangers to unlimited migration, because that by itself can be a form of conquest. For example, if you look at what happened to the Native Americans, or if you look at what happened to the Palestinians, in both of those cases, we can say, well, is this not conquest by demographic aggression? Yeah. And so that's what some of the more libertarian-leaning immigration restrictionists will sometimes argue. And when it comes to the policies, Hans Hermann Hoppe's policies on immigration, or his proposed policies, are definitely interesting. I've actually criticized Hoppe before. Like, I know when his book Democracy: The God That Failed came out, I actually wrote a very positive review of the book, but then I wrote a follow-up review about certain parts of the book where I thought he was, going over the line as far as some of his views on things like, say, immigration. In fact, I think I once joked, well, he was, he was an anarcho-Stalinist with some of his proposed immigration policies, or he was I think I called him. I said maybe he's not quite George Lincoln Rockwell, but he's moving in that direction. But I mean, perhaps that was an exaggeration. But I do think that Hoppe with immigration sort of crosses the line from libertarianism into something more like paleoconservatism,
which is just fascism but red.
Well, it's not as extreme as fascism, but it is old school American conservatism. Like, if you go back and you look at what conservatism in the United States was prior to, say, World War II, it was basically the same thing that this revived America First stuff of today was. It was, on one hand, it tended to be relatively anti-interventionist in foreign policy, not perfectly so, but it was also immigration restrictionist, and it was also trade protectionist. And that's basically the old school 1920s era, Herbert Hoover, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge type of conservatism. It's basically it's a sort of a Robert Taft 1950s era conservatism.
It can be.
And Pat Buchanan sort of revived that somewhat in the early 90s. And now with this MAGA, America First, Donald Trump, that movement has sort of revived all of these older traditions in American style conservatism, as opposed to the neocons and then what I always called the CIA right, which is the Buckleyites that came out of the 50s and 60s. But none of that stuff is anarchism, much less libertarian. Oh, well, it's not libertarianism, much less anarchism. You do have sort of a classical liberal trend within historic American conservatism, but that was always subordinated to these other things. And also, a lot of the anti-immigration stuff you hear today is it's very similar to what used to be called the Know Nothings. That was a movement back in the early 19th century, prior to the Civil War. The Know Nothings were they were not Confederates; they were anti-Confederate. In fact, they were anti-slavery in large part because a lot of them were racists who didn't want black people in the country. Period. Not even as slaves. But they were the Know Nothings had a party called the American Party, and they were a conspiratorial party. They were all about the Catholic churches involved. They're very anti-Catholic, anti-Masonic, anti-Jewish, and largely anti-immigration, and largely for that reason. They're like, well, we can't have Irish people, or in the United States, they'll give the United States to the Pope or something, or we can't have Germans, they'll give they'll give the United States to the Holy Roman Empire, which was still in, I think, no, not the Holy Roman Empire, the German monarch, whatever, was still in power back then. So this kind of xenophobic nationalism has always been there in American culture, and some of this America First stuff has kind of revived it. But you could argue immigration from a lot of different angles, from a libertarian or anarchistic perspective. You could, the invitation only paradigm, you could say that, well, the United States is the collective property of the taxpayers. So should not the taxpayers, as say shareholders in the United States, not be able to say who can come in or who can come out, just like whoever owns a business can say who can come in or come out? That's one angle. There's some people that use the house analogy, like, would you not lock your doors? Do you let anybody into your house? There's other people who say, well, a house is not comparable to a political unit like a state, a country, or government, because that's something that exists by force. Buying and selling houses is trade, whereas the government rules by force and controls borders by force. So that's a pro-immigration argument from the other end. There's also pragmatic arguments, of course. Like, I've heard some labor-oriented left anarchists, like hardcore syndicalists, not so much in this country, but in Europe, argue against immigration on the grounds that what you're doing is you're flooding the labor market with a large and enlarged labor pool that allows the ruling class to suppress wages, more of almost like a socialist type of argument. And then you can also say, well, if you have unlimited numbers of people coming into the country, the ruling class can theoretically manipulate that towards their own ends. And you hear a lot of right-leaning libertarians say, well, immigration is not really just people moving around; it's also people who are being subsidized by the state. That migrants are given money for relocation, and you have sectors at least of the ruling class who want this because they see this as a source of cheap labor, or they hope they can cultivate immigrant communities as future voting blocks for their own party, or something like that. It always seemed to me that a compromise would be something like this, meaning that perhaps at the general national level, you could have, something like Hoppe's idea of invitation only, but then at the local level, if a locality wants to do something like a sanctuary city, that's fine as well. I know one time I was on some sort of right-leaning podcast, sort of conservative paleoconish, I forget which one podcast, and I mentioned that idea, and some of the listeners freaked out, like, you're advocating mass immigration, you're defending sanctuary cities, After I just said, well, on a meta paradigm level, you could perhaps have the invitation only model, but it's one of those topics that there's no real easy solution to, because you could. Even if you wanted to restrict the debate only to libertarians or only to anarchists, or only people who theoretically believe the state is illegitimate or theoretically believe in the non-aggression principle, you can still approach it from multiple angles and get different results. It's one of those issues like the abortion issue where, like if you take pro-life to its logical extreme, you end up banning contraceptives and stuff like that. Well, why does life begin at conception? Why doesn't it begin before that? It's or if you take pro-choice to its extreme, you could start making arguments in favor of infanticide. Like you've got theorists like philosophers like Peter Singer who actually make that argument. That there's no real difference between an abortion 4 months into pregnancy and euthanizing an infant 6 months after birth or something. So there's all kinds of a lot of these really complicated questions. I don't really know that you can come up with the one size fits all or some theoretically perfect answer to.
So I've got an answer to the house thing, because you said that it's similar to houses, but also the people make that argument, but also that there should be the shareholder argument, that all these people are investing in the U.S. thing. But like, let me just say, like, it's a chicken and egg situation, but it's much more obvious than a chicken and egg situation to me, because, like, first off, um, like, chicken and eggs is an interesting concept, because if you have an egg, it's obviously going to be the source of whatever new genetics you have. So obviously the egg came first. But like, uh, that evolutionary biology quip aside. The argument that I could make here is that this isn't a matter of voluntarily joining a shareholder arrangement. This is a matter of the people involved in the creation of the United States stealing everything that they had and then distributing it to the people in what Murray Rothbard would call state capitalism, and like deciding then to turn it into a tax farm. And the reason this matters, the reason it matters that that like it was stolen and then distributed, is because it makes the argument much more like it, elucidated. It's not just like shareholders and shit. What it is I'm going to decide that you can't invite somebody to your house, or that that person can't like camp next to a property that I like have also decided I control. You know, I'm going to say that because I'm a shareholder in this corporation that we call this neighborhood, that we call this city, that we call this state, that we call this country, um, that we call this globalist empire. You could extend it out as far as the power reaches. And so you could say, I don't like what this person over there, wherever that is doing with their like house. I don't like what they're doing with their house in terms of immigration. I don't like the fact that they hold Muslim prayers in there and not Christian prayers. I don't like the fact that they're running a lemonade stand in front of it. If you can control immigration because it might affect your economy, then you can control everything else because it might affect your economy. There is no reason to limit these arguments strictly to immigration. So if you can make this argument that immigration should be restricted because it has a potentially negative effect on an economy, then I could say that dropping it like at that point is arbitrary, and that people who want the conversation to stop there are really just trying to have the conversation stop there because they don't want to have the longer discussion about what maintaining a state that could even stop that sort of thing entails, and what that state would probably also want to stop or
No,
control, or et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the time, when you end up with these people, you end up with people with a bad culture, with a bad mentality, who say that I can control what these people are doing because they might replace me, or they might invade me, or they might be subsidized. The solutions are very simple. The solutions are stopping fucking up those other places, and repairing what was fucked up. And it's also like creating better like environments here, so that people will no longer feel the need to have a state, and the state itself can dissolve. And like that's going to involve a culture of anarchy. It's going to involve people gradually moving away from this mentality of control. And if they don't, then they're only going to continue the control mechanisms here, which are reliant on control mechanisms that they've built over there. And the problem literally will not stop. We either have to control everything by the root, which is control, and trying to control other people. And the only way you can do that is anarchy, or we will never have anarchy. If we just allow people to secede but still fuck up other countries, those other countries are still going to want to immigrate. If we allow people to secede and those countries are still run by people who make things bad here and make these people feel unsafe without a government, for instance, Texas and their anti-trans legislation, and their like, their governor's open support of that guy who, like that veteran who like hated black people and shot the furry because the furry had an open carry gun. It's very, very obvious that that was like, I drove my car into that crowd and then they were surrounding me. No, you drove your car into a place where there were people, and then there were people around your car. Dumb fuck. But he already said in text messages he wanted to kill Black Lives Matter protesters. They were all, I might have to kill some black people today. Text messages he sent. And so, like, when that happens, when you have a governor, Greg Abbott, who is at the helm, who all these other governors are standing behind, when that governor is at the helm and like he says that guy should be pardoned, Garrett Foster should be pardoned, I think was his name. When you say that was a miscarriage of justice, what you're saying is that people who don't adopt my view of politics should be murdered. And that's a very, very dangerous precedent to set that is only further applied by fucking the razor wire that they put in the water and pushed families into. This government is evil. It's an evil government down there in Texas. And there is exactly zero reason to believe that this government's seceding or deciding who gets to come in and come out, or being in control of its own foreign policy, and therefore probably fucking up other countries just as much as its corporate partners right now have done, like Texaco, for instance, named Texaco for a reason, that this would suddenly result in an anarchist paradigm. It wouldn't. What it would result in is theocracy and republicanism and maybe fascism.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. Sorry. Noah, did you want to say something?
Yeah, about the whole border-tarian thing, I think is nonsense, because you cannot compare your house or your community to state borders that are held up by coercion and force. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I got you. All right, so a few things here. To first go on Keith's point, like when the USSR broke up, a good example, yes, there was problems. There was Milosevic and things like that. But there's also Kazakhstan. Like when they made the whole Borat joke, I'm like, wait, Kazakhstan is doing pretty well. Uzbekistan is doing pretty well. Like people think Kazakhstan's a little hot. No, they have pretty thriving cities, stuff like that. So I would say, though, there's a significant difference, though. I think there's higher civic capital in the United States, meaning people have more of a respect for property rights without even, like, you could call it natural law or common law, like, hey, I'm not going to hurt you as long as you don't hurt me. I'm not saying there aren't people like who are violent or cause problems, but what I would say is this. We live in a digital age now, so you can educate people and still spread the philosophy. So in that being said, like Saudi Arabia, if you did that, okay, well, here's Insula Qui. What is this? Anarcho-monarch. In Soviet countries, say the Soviet Union or the European Union broke up today, we have the ability to educate people by giving them like digital copies, literally, of Rothbard and explaining it in a very simplistic way. I can explain Rothbard.
Just one thing. I know you've got a lot to say. If a country destabilizes, the chaos that will result from that is not going to be the kind of chaos where most people are going to stop and read a fucking book. We need to do this before that happens.
I'm saying to do that. I'm saying to secede now, get the education now.
That's not what that is, though. You have to get the education before secession happens. Go ahead.
I would say this. I would say it's not going to be a perfect, just like things are human. They're subject to error. I would still say, look, get the education, but while you're doing the education, still, we need to decentralize. It's not going to be, to be fair, I don't understand everything about Austrian economics. I don't understand everything about like syndicalism or stuff like that. But I know enough to say, hey, I have the basics down. I can explain the main ideas of conquest bread to you. So let's go ahead and start this just like you would start a business. Okay, I have the basics of how I'm going to drop ship. I have a product and I have an idea. I don't know if it'll work, but I'm going to run ads and play with it. And that's exactly what I did. Same thing with YouTube channels, faceless YouTube channels. So that's my argument to you is get the basics down, which we can do very quickly with digital technology, which maybe we couldn't do for Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan. And still, while we're doing that, implement some kind of secession procedure while doing that. As far as, Thailand, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. You could technically still have an anarchist society of Salafis. It wouldn't be anywhere I'd want to live, but fine, keep them all in one society. I don't care. And if they still want a king, have a king, but hopefully they just give them the idea the king should not do anything, and you want Allah as your supreme thing. So reduce the king's power. And that is essentially maybe what Tolkien was describing. Hopefully that makes sense.
It doesn't make sense,
Anarcho-monarchism
and I
isn't real.
disagree.
It isn't real. It's I want to say it's a psyop, but I don't know. It's just ramblings of insane people. Monarchism was the old money of statism, right? So combining anarchy and monarchism sounds like the biggest oxymoron on the fucking planet.
That's what I thought, but then I looked into it.
Well, yeah. Okay.
Well, of all
what
the
did you
people I've
find
ever
when you did?
known,
Sorry.
of all the people I've ever known who tried to claim the label anarcho-monarchism, either known them personally or by reputation, there's actually a lot of subsets of anarcho-monarchism, as we might guess. There are some who believe in the idea of an intentional nation, almost like a micronation, kind of like these seastead ideas that Patrick Friedman came up with, where you have an intentional nation, but it's a monarchy. So it's voluntary monarchism or something, or voluntary decentralist monarchism. There's another version where it's all about like sovereign localities, like village communities and stuff like that. But they're sort of united through this symbolic monarchism, that's sort of monarchy. That's like it's really more like where the monarch is really just more like the president of the Rotary Club or something of that nature. And then there's some who are actual more traditional monarchists who say, well, that a monarchy is better at keeping the state at bay than a mass democracy, because with a mass democracy where you have everybody has voting rights, what ends up happening is that the state has to appeal to more and more people, and they do that through growing the state. That's the Hans Hermann Hoppe argument. So there's actually different types of anarcho-monarchists, which just like this if you break down all these different categories, you also always see that there's categories within categories. But as far as secession in the United States, as I said earlier, I don't think Texas would just simply secede alone by itself and go off and be an independent nation. I think for that to happen, one of two things would have to happen. One would be a collapse of the entire United States, like the former Soviet Union and the Yugoslavia and the Warsaw Pact. Another possibility is something like what happened in Japan at one point, where during the period of shogunate Japan, you actually had a system where you had I guess you could call it polycentric centralism, where you had multiple competing governments all claiming to be the real government of Japan, because they couldn't, the government fractured, and then everybody was claiming we're the real government. So you ended up with about 3 or 4 different governments all claiming to be the real, the actual Japanese government. And then whatever territory they tended to be most prevalent in, that's where they tended to dominate. And parallel to that in the United States would be, let's say when the election comes up in November, that nobody can agree on who won the election. So the Republicans say, well, no, Donald Trump is our rightful president, and the other side said Biden or whomever is our rightful president. So the two, so it ends up with a situation where on a de facto level, the red states are one country with Donald Trump as president, or the blue states are one country with with whomever, Biden or whatever, as their president. Perhaps there's even another group of states with RFK as their president or something. Japan actually had a system like that during the shogunate period for a while. And in fact, China had systems like that at various points. There was the famous War of the Three Feudatories or something like that. We had these different localities that had their own monarchs, kind of these non-contiguous territorial monarchical systems. So I could see the United States falling apart into something like that as well. As to what the disadvantages of that would be, obviously one is possible civil war. That's probably the biggest disadvantage. you could argue that it would certainly put more constraints on the United States as far as overseas actions. Not as many Iraq wars and stuff like that. So that would be, I guess, that would be the upside. Then there's also the question of, well, who gets the nukes and what are they going to do with them? That was actually a serious issue when the Soviet Union collapsed. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out worse than it did. But I do think that that's probably what this kind of secession we're talking about would look like in the United States. I don't really see one of the states just simply saying, well, bye, we're leaving. I mean, the federal government is not going to allow that. They're not going to allow, like Texas is a big part of the U.S. economy. It's a major source of tax revenue. They're not going to just let an entire state walk away and do their own thing. And now I do think it's possible, more practical to have things like these sanctuary cities. Those are, where you have individual localities where there's some issue that's popular locally, but it hasn't really caught on nationally. But you can sort of do your own thing around that issue, like the way a lot of the places started legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana at one point, and then the sanctuary cities, and then from the other side of the cultural spectrum, you've got the Second Amendment sanctuaries. There are places like that here in Virginia where I live that are Second Amendment sanctuary counties, I think they call them. So that I can see that working, but I don't really see something like Texas independence. I think it's either going to be all or nothing. Basically, it's either you're going to have this very micro level secession, like sanctuary cities, or that's informal, or you're going to have something where the whole system collapses or just fragments into a multiplicity of people geographical units or political units claiming to be the real state.
One thing I would be curious to know, because, yes, I've seen, the EU looks like you had Brexit with the EU, whether or not you consider that good or not, and also the breaking up of the USSR, and we could definitely, discuss who gets nukes or what happens like that. My thing would be the good thing about that would be is yes, less conflict, less foreign aid, and then the ability to issue competing currencies, which I think is a good idea. Plus, it allows for what you talk about in your book, Why I Am an Anarcho-Pluralist, to take hold a little bit better. Because if you don't have Orange Man or Sleepy Joe looking over things, I think it's easier to say, look, hey, I have in my town, I want to do Agoristan. I've read Konkin, guys, I think, and you go to your city council and you're like, hey, look, I think Konkin was onto something. And then somebody goes to their city council, like, no, I don't think so, but Kropotkin was onto something. All right. And I kind of want to see how these things work out in tandem, just like the Amish kind of work out. So yeah, I could be open to that, like more stuff like the Amish, but obviously with more technology and less thing. I don't exactly know what I consider the Amish. Like, I kind of consider the Amish kind of a mix between, like, as you call them, I like them, the primies or primitivist / ANCOM type things. And I'd like to see more of that, but with more different ideas and more different things. There's still the question of how you get the technical guys to like the, maybe people who want to be more primitive, or how you get maybe like the Chomsky people to work with the ANCAPs, or the ANCAPs to work with. And I think that would be easier to solve, but I could also be open to municipalities or cities or small towns breaking off too. So
there's a lot of ideas like that have been floated in anarchist circles, and you actually see it being practiced in some places, like in Mexico, for example. You've got the Zapatista territories. You've also got Cherán, which is they don't really identify as anarchists, but it's an indigenous city or town where they kicked out the Mexican government. So they're in fact practicing anarchists, I guess, if not ideological ones. In the Kurdish territories, or parts of the Kurdish territories, you have the what they call democratic confederalism, which some people consider that anarchistic and some don't. Some say it's just socialism, but there are left-wing anarchists that admire that system.
Rojava?
What's Rojava? Yeah, or Java. Yeah, and then you also have ideas like you have the Startup Societies Foundation. That's a group that advocates for things like seasteads and micronations and intentional communities and communes and special economic zones and all this kind of stuff. And these aren't necessarily about creating whole new states, separate countries. Although there's new country projects as well, but it's more about the idea of creating autonomous zones within individual countries and that kind of stuff. Murray Bookchin, the anarchist thinker Murray Bookchin, was big on that. He had this concept called municipalism, which was about anarchists trying to build anarchistic towns and stuff. He was from Vermont, he was from New York City, but he lived in Vermont, and he was really influenced by the New England town model idea. And as you were saying, this kind of activity could span the whole spectrum of anarchist thought, or just political thought, or cultural orientations generally. You could have like thousands and thousands of these places for every kind of philosophy there is, and then that way you can kind of build it from the bottom up. Before you start attacking the central government, you have all these anarchistic towns and associated others that are already building up a dual power or an alternative infrastructure and things like that. Although a danger with this is that the more popular and successful this became, the more the central government might try to make a move against it, saying, wait a minute, this is getting out of hand. So that's another issue as well.
Do you, oh, sorry, I was going to ask a question. And if you're, I'm sure you are, because you have like a wealth of knowledge, but Robert Nozick in his book, Anarchy, Utopia, and the State, does say there could be a predatory state, like say a Murray Rothbard. And I'm taking the thing, because I did say there's no warlords in anarcho-capitalism, but a lot of people from other sides of anarchy challenged me on that, including Jeremiah. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well, Jeremiah. Let's say a Murray Rothbard society did get a very powerful private security agency or defense agency. Would that be something you would worry about, or would say no, syndicalists, militias or federations could balance that?
I'm always worried.
Well, that's certainly a danger. Yeah, I mean, Nozick's theory was that with these PDAs, these private defense agencies that Murray Rothbard advocated for, that they would trend towards monopoly. They would eventually combine forces and become a de facto state, if in practice, if not in name. And yeah, I think that's a real issue too. I think that's an issue with other kinds of anarchism. The issue with syndicalism, for example, is how do you prevent this from just becoming another socialist bureaucracy? With anarcho-communism, you have the same issue. How do you prevent that from becoming capital C communism? Particularly the larger the scale of it. You could certainly have an anarcho-communist economy. Like I don't know if you guys are familiar with a place called Twin Oaks, but there's a place called Twin Oaks. It exists about 30 minutes from where I live. I've never actually been there, but I know people who live there. But it's a commune that's been in existence for about 50 years. And they typically limit their membership to about 100 people or so. And to join it, you have to go through a probationary period. So it's not like something where just anybody can show up and be there. But they've existed as a self-managed, autonomous income sharing commune. It's basically anarcho-communism in practice for about 50 years successfully. And theoretically, you could have thousands or millions of places like this. You could have a country the size of the United States with 1 million places like Twin Oaks, and that would be an anarcho-communist society. So I do think that anarcho-communism is possible, but at the same time, there's also the question of, well, the larger it gets, is there going to be a trend towards centralization? And are you going to end up with capital C communism, just like with anarcho-capitalism? Like a lot of anarcho-capitalists envision, well, anarcho-capitalism is lots of relatively small traders or individual entrepreneurs trading with each other. But the bigger a business gets, the more it combines with other businesses, the larger and larger it gets. What's going to prevent it from creating a state? So then it's going to be state capitalism. So that's a problem too. So you have the same problem any direction you go in. Like, how do you avoid capitalist oligarchy on one hand or socialist bureaucracy on the other hand?
And see, that's the thing that I always say, is that if you don't start from that philosophical grounding and convince people, then all you're doing is dealing with the prospect of once we decentralize trademark symbol, register, CR, whatever, once we get our decentralized brand decentralization with these people who weren't serious about it to begin with and who really just wanted power, a lot of these people have their own ideas about how things always should have been run, and they would be happy to play along for a temporary bit until they became the only game in town, and became like the primary like providers of protection, so that they could then switch over. We've got the most weapons, we've got the most gear, we've got the most potential to kick ass. That's why we're the best. And so we can just say what we want, and if you don't do it, we'll fuck you up. So you have to have people on a ground level. You have to have a people on a ground level, like dead level, foundation level, who are okay philosophically with the conclusion of anarchy and who are going to try to do that. You have to, as the motivational people say, surround yourself with people on the same mission as you. That seems like fucking obvious to me. But like so
Right.
many people on the right want to pretend that this would just magically be okay, that people would just like, kumbaya in the end because of some amorphous concept of competition. Sure, maybe if they had like the rooting and the grounding in fucking anarchy and trying to not dominate. But if the reason that they're competing is for increased power, which is something that security organizations and states often do, and that's why they mirror each other and are so okay working with each other, like they will become very like each other very quickly and very often, if not checked, and if not like uh, on the same page as anarchy. And a lot of them aren't. A lot of them factually aren't. And like, you bring up all these like alleged private like solutions. Dale Brown, for instance. I'm not saying he's a terrible person, but a lot of what he does is corral people and wait for the cops to come. It's not like he's saying we're going to supplant the state. It's we're going to help the state do its job and have less people die. Maybe it would be different in an anarchist society, but maybe it wouldn't. And right now, he's helping the state. Blackwater, like, which is now, fuck, I forget.
X.
Academy. I think they're called
XE. That's what they're called now. Yeah, Academy. So I think they went from Blackwater to XE to Academy. Yeah, they're a good example because they're a national private security thing. But do they provide security? No, they murder people. They help the state run their missions. So the fact that something is private does not, in fact, mean that there will not be a private-public partnership. In fact, Javier Milei is working on a private-public partnership with the prison system right now, and he wants militarized, semi-private policing as well, which is exactly what he talked about in his promises that so many little cucks didn't want to read. So, like, the ultimate truth here is we're dealing with quite a wide variety of people, and some of them are bad fucking actors. And if we don't have the baked in shit that we're going to deal with those bad fucking actors before we even get started, if we're just going to say, yeah, secede, including the bad actors, we'll be fine. No, the fuck we won't. We need to get rid of the bad actors. We need to have like actual philosophical anarchist grounding, or we're fucked. And I don't want to be fucked in that way. Maybe someday later on down the line, after a few drinks and after a nice dinner, but not after a secession and a brutal, bloody war that will take a lot of civilian lives until maybe the U.S. empire is beaten back in the way that Afghanistan and Vietnam and all these other places where a huge fucking amount of people died and a huge amount of the territory was destroyed, so that we could eventually get to the point where they leave and the Taliban supplants them, or the current government in Vietnam is corrupt as hell, and like all of these institutional places, like they just formed their own security states, their own tyrannies. They didn't form free societies. It's not like Afghanistan pushed the US out and then suddenly they're anarcho-stan. They're not. They pushed the US out on the promises of the people who were entrenched in power part of which is because of U.S. funding and support to begin with, and the Taliban and the $53 million they got before 9/11, and the fucking support that the original people who would splinter off and then eventually coalesce to become the Taliban got from Operation Cyclone and follow-up operations. Like, these are the people that are controlling these territories now. It's not a matter of saying that, like, oh, well, if we just decentralize, everything will be roses. It won't.
I
The
didn't say
people in the locations need to want anarchy, or decentralization will just be smaller tyrannies.
okay.
Well,
So
I think
here's
one comment on that. I think what you're saying is ultimately the correct position, at least on a meta level, because the it's really, what is the common saying about politics is downstream from culture or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that culturally, you have to have a foundation for any kind of political system to work. Like the American political system in its current form. Well, whatever you can, if you trace the roots of it, it's obvious where it came from. Well, it's bits and pieces of English common law and bits and pieces of Greco-Roman tradition and that kind of stuff as well. So politics is downstream from culture. And I think that ultimately for anarchism proper of any kind, whatever label you want to put on it to work, you would have to have a cultural foundation where most people generally agree with some basic shared cultural norms or social norms or ethical norms or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, and a significant majority too, not just like 50.0001%. Go ahead.
Well, right now, I'd just be happy with the 50%, but yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great compared to what we have.
I do agree with that, though. I mean, I do agree with that. One analogy I often use when I discuss this, I've discussed this elsewhere, is to religion. If you like, for example, there was a time when most civilizations throughout the world were polytheistic, and then eventually those were supplanted by monotheistic religions. Now you can make an argument as to which is better, polytheism or monotheism. I mean, I'm not religious or even a theist, so I'm not. I'm sort of out of that game. But nowadays in America and in other similar countries, you can find tons of people who self-identify as Christian, claim some kind of Christian heritage or tradition. You don't find that many people who identify as Mithraists or as followers of Osiris or worshipers of Zalmoxis or something like that. Although you do have these neo-pagans, but that's a very small number of people. And if you had a person running for president today saying, well, I think America's law should be based on the Bible, well, you'd have a large percentage of Americans that would agree with that, but to some degree. But if you have if you had somebody running for president saying, well, I think that America's law should be based on the Hammurabi Code, or it should be based on the Homeric epics, most people wouldn't even know what you're talking about.
I think America's laws should be based on the Sonic comics. If we were more like the Freedom Fighters, that's the true religion. Go ahead. Sorry, I had to say that.
But what that represents is a total cultural transformation from the ancient pagan world to the dominance of these Abrahamic religions. Whether you like those religions or not, it was something that was a complete cultural transformation. Not in ways that were always happy. I mean, there was plenty of persecution of pagans.
Yeah, I actually have a question about that, though. Or I have a question in regards. Sorry.
Yeah, as well as rival Christians, too. I don't know as much about Islamic history, but there seems to be some parallels to Christianity. But another example that I've used is the Enlightenment. The culture, the intellectual culture that came out of the Enlightenment I guess you could trace it back to the 17th century on into the 18th century. And then you have the American and French and Haitian and German and other revolutions. And that really creates what we think of as modernity. And certainly that brought about very far-reaching cultural changes as well. For instance, most countries don't have absolute monarchies anymore. Most countries don't have these hereditary titled aristocracies. we don't really have churches that had the kind of power that the Roman Catholic Church had in the Middle Ages, or that the old COV and its classical form had. I mean, we still have religions that has influence, and you could say we have other institutions that take the place of it, but it was a fairly far-reaching transformation if you compare, say, a medieval society with a modern society, just in terms of cultural norms and values and institutional structures. So that's another very, very far-reaching paradigm. But for anarchism to become something that was viable on a meta level, and really become culturally entrenched, that's the kind of paradigm shift you'd have to have. It would have to be like the rise of the monotheistic religions and in replacement of the pagan polytheistic religions, or it would have to be like the way that the Enlightenment replaced the culture of the Middle Ages. It would be that profound. It would be that far-reaching. What were you going to ask, Kareem?
Okay, well, I was gonna ask something. I was gonna make a joke first. I was gonna say Jeremiah, since I shared the meme, he was talking about potential intercourse, and I say, hey, Amy friend zone Sonic, so I don't think that'll happen. We can play instead of Green Hill friend zone 1. So, but okay, here's
and just canonically, like if anything, it's the opposite. Like she keeps on trying to get it, and he's just like not having it. He's not ready to settle down yet.
Yeah, keep playing the field. All right. So, okay, here's my question based on that. I'm gonna give a less of ideal example, but me and Jeremiah actually had a really long debate in Keybase, as we usually do on this. I even made the joke, and I'm thinking of even making a T-shirt. The answer to 1984 is 1991, not 1776. Sorry, and the reason is because even though it's a cryptarchy. And I was very young, learning about this, even being a little kid, figuring out, putting the pieces together, that when the Somalis overthrew Muhammad Syed Barre, and then the United States was ineffective in trying to push a government there, and then Ethiopia couldn't do it, and then other countries couldn't do it, I was always told that the warlords were just fighting. And during the George Bush era, the argument, if you don't support Iraq, well, just move to Somalia. But then when I actually learned about Somalia from a great economist called Peter Leeson, who's a self-identified anarcho-capitalist as well, an economist, what I found is that warlords checked each other's power. And I know this doesn't sound ideal, but yes, there was violent people who said, well, just like Capone would not fight Bugs Moran or the Jewish mafia, well, I am violent, but my violence is checked by somebody else. And then eventually what they did is they took a customary law, like you're saying, called Zir, which is tribal law. And because of that, I'm not saying Somalia was a good place to live, but I am saying if you were stuck in Africa, probably would want to live there post-Barre regime after the warlords were done fighting, because A, they checked each other's power. B, they had Sharia law for courts. They maintained that. And they had Zir. An example of what they did that Dr. Leeson talks about is if you have a clan, if I am part of a clan and I kill a member of another clan, the entire clan has to pay a tribute to that clan. So even though people don't like each other per se, even though it's a violent environment, even though warlords are less than ideal people and do not have any civic capital really whatsoever, even though it was bad, I think it could be easily argued, and fine, I would agree with Jeremiah, it's not anarchy, it's cryptarchy. I think it could be ideally argued that even that relative decentralization produced a better socioeconomic outcome in Somalia before the government was reinstated and before this Al-Shabaab stuff happened. If that is true, what I would say is this, it's kind of a combination, educate people, but I still say you can even have violent decentralization be curbed by relative power structure sharing and then the institution of customary law. And I'll add one more point. I looked at Joseph Pierre Proudhon. I'm not an expert in his works anyway. I'm trying to learn more. But what does he say is important? The golden rule. That's also a foundation. What does he say is also important? The social contract, if everyone agrees on it. Where did I heard that? Spooner. That's where Spooner got that from. So there is the foundations. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to ask or say.
Well, the answer to 1984 is 1991, but that's because it's when Sonic started coming out.
Yes, and Somalia. But is Somalia
Nope.
an example? Is Somalia an example? I guess my question is this. Sorry, I went on a rant. 2 questions. Is Somalia an example of effective relative decentralization because of power sharing measures, not because people are virtuous? And like, I could make the argument that California would be better off if the Bloods and the Crips were fighting each other and then wanted to stop instead of having Gavin Newsom. Second of all, are some of the foundations already there in place? Because Joseph Pierre Proudhon's ideas aren't super far off from some things a lot of people believe, like the social contract. If everyone agrees, not a fake one, and the golden rule. Sorry.
Yeah, well, that gets back to the ideas that are in the book demanding the impossible. You know, you and I have discussed that before, the Peter Marshall book. And Peter Marshall goes back throughout history and traces these different cultures that have had all of these different currents that sort of feed into the development of modern anarchism. And certainly that's one of them. You know, he talks about how in a lot of these traditional, indigenous, tribal, as well as cultural and religious cultures, you have these different ideas that feed into the development of anarchist thought. And I think that that's an example of having a cultural foundation that is sort of the concrete on which the house is built. Like, as far as the Kritarchy in Somalia in the early 90s, yeah, I mean, that was a good system, you know, given the limitations of the time. I mean, given the level of poverty they had, given that they just come out of a civil war. You know, not ideal circumstances to be in, all things considered, but given what they had to work with, yeah, I do think they developed a very interesting system. If we want to point to examples from around the world that are somewhat prototypical, we can look at something like the Swiss canton system. The Swiss canton system is one where, you know, Switzerland is really a federation of about 26 what they call cantons. They're like provinces. And then in each canton, they're decentralized to what they call communes, or like counties, or by American standards. And it's a multicultural society. It's primarily European ethnic groups and with different languages. Like, I know people who've lived in Switzerland that'll say in some localities, you can have a public city council meeting in 3 different languages with translators. It's almost like the UN. You know, but you have the Swiss Italians, the Swiss Germans, the Swiss French, the Roma, and, you know, and I'm not sure who else. So that's an example of a decentralized multicultural society that actually works fairly well. You know, it's one of the more prosperous and peaceful nations in the world. In fact, it's interesting to compare Switzerland with the United States, because the two systems of the two countries started around the same time, and I think Switzerland has been much more able to preserve its system than the United States has. You know, the United States has expanded into this imperium, whereas I think Switzerland was probably better able to maintain its traditional system because it is a small country that's geographically contained, whereas the United States was a frontier society and it was able to perpetually expand. But Switzerland is a really interesting model, just like Kritarchy and Somalia. You know, there's plenty of examples of these things from all over the world. I mean, even places like Afghanistan. You know, I wouldn't write off anywhere, because in all cultures, in all ethnic groups, and all religions, you have people that have quasi-anarchist prototypes that can be built on. You know, you find that even people you would never suspect, you know, a lot of Western anarchists, for example, are very surprised when they hear that Korea and China and some of the East Asian countries actually have strong anarchist traditions, because they think that anarchism is just somehow a Western thing that, you know, Europeans came up with a few hundred years ago. And no, even in the early 20th century, there were large anarchist movements in China, in Korea. You know, just like a lot of the left-wing anarchists like to point to the Catalonia during the Spanish Revolution as sort of a proto-anarchy. We had prototypes for that in Korea and China as well.
And arguably, vis-a-vis man-made laws, Jesus was an anarchist. So,
yeah.
Hey, could you name some of the East Asian anarchist movements? So
Lao Tzu,
right.
definitely looking to Taoism and Lao Tzu.
Bao Xing,
yeah, well, as far as localities, like not just thinkers, but there was the Shimnen Prefecture is one. That's definitely one. All of this stuff is on. There's a video I did. I don't know if it's still online or not, but if you just Google my name and then Google anarchist communities, past, present, and future, there's like a lecture I did in London about 5 or 6 years ago where I talked about all these historic anarchist or quasi-anarchist communities that existed in many different cultures in different parts of the world. And these weren't all people who self-identified as anarchists. Some of them predate modern anarchism, but even within the framework of modern ideological anarchism, like people who would claim someone like Bakunin as an ancestor, you found movements like that in China and Japan and India, as well as in the West and Africa, Latin America.
Would you, from your expertise, Keith, I have a few questions on some things I've read. Would you consider Cospaia in Italy an ANCAP society? Would you consider Gaelic Ireland also maybe an anarchist society? And even from my reading of, and Alan Watts talks about this as well, and probably playing too much video games, but the Han Dynasty seemed to me to start, not its ending. The Han Dynasty lasted for 500 years. Take that, the guy on Twitter who thinks, haha, America's so great. The Han Dynasty was a minarchy, in my opinion, with taxes that lasted 500 years. It ended very badly, but with the three kingdoms. But
yeah, the Han Dynasty, as you said, it lasted for a century, and no, they didn't have a very overarching intrusive state. It was a monarchy by modern standards. Modern states are much more expansive and much more intrusive than a lot of these older states were. But in the traditional Chinese culture, the actual norm was they tended to be very village community oriented. And it was interesting because when Western explorers or missionaries and all of that first went to China, one of the things that they found was that in Chinese culture, you didn't have a traditional overarching religion like you often did in the West, whether it was Christianity or Islam, before that, the Roman state cult. Instead, religion tended to be very localized. So you would go to one village and they would worship one set of gods and one set of ancestors. And you go to another village and they've got an entirely different set of ideas. And then the emperor was sort of like an imperium over all of that, but they really didn't have this kind of massive state bureaucracy that we think of being associated with modern states. So yeah, it would be a monarchy, but compared to modern states, and it was very decentralized with lots of local variation in terms of culture and custom. The example you gave from Italy, I'm not that familiar with that. I do know that in Renaissance Italy, you had a lot of trade towns and merchant towns and stuff that developed, and you had out of that came the city states like Venice and all of that, and Florence and some of those places, and you could say that's like a proto monarchy as well. Gaelic Ireland, yeah, and also Iceland. If anything, Iceland was probably more anarchistic than Ireland, although both of those were kind of proto-anarchistic. Or I've heard both anarcho-capitalist and anarcho-communist cite both Ireland and Iceland as proto-anarchies. So there is some commonality there.
yeah, I think it's interesting because ANCOMs and ANCAPs will fight each other like, no, public, this property, you're doing this wrong. But then at the end of the day, they're like, okay, I've read Kropotkin, I've read Rothbard. Yeah, Ireland's pretty good. Oh, okay, I like medieval Iceland. David Friedman has a good paper. I think it's David Friedman on medieval Iceland, from what I've heard, but I've not looked into it. So yeah, I can just kind of, because we've been going almost hour and a half, I'd be curious to shift gears just to get your guys' thoughts. If you saw I haven't looked into it extensively, the ICJ ruling, kind of get your thoughts on that. You think like some people said like, oh, okay, well, they wanted a little bit more of it. Some people said it was good. Some people said, well, it was bad. Some people just said, well, this is kind of like them playing middle ground. So I'd be curious.
It's toothless. The Western nations will never accede to this sort of court ruling because they would be tried and convicted immediately. It doesn't matter. None of this matters. Until we start crushing governments, we lose.
Well, I think that what happened at the ICJ turned out better than I thought it would. When I first heard,
that's fair.
When I first heard that South Africa was bringing the genocide charges against Israel, my first thought was, well, who cares? Because the ICJ does not have an enforcement arm, so This is this is just a symbolic gesture. Um, but then I started to notice that Israel seemed genuinely worried about this. I noticed that there was a change in the rhetoric and propaganda coming out of Israel when that happened, when the charges were filed. So I was like, well, obviously they take it seriously, so it must be important to them. As far as the when the case was being heard, I thought South Africa presented their case very well. Israel's defense, I thought, was pathetic. It was on the level of, well, Hamas was mean to us, so we can do genocide all we want, and those who say otherwise are anti-Semitic. That was
My dad can beat up your dad.
right, yeah. But as far as how the judges would vote, there were 17 judges on the panel, and I had thought that it would come down to how the BRICS nations voted, because I figured all of the Western countries would side with Israel. Obviously, Israel would side with itself. The other countries from the global south, I thought that would probably depend on which bloc they were aligned with. But it actually turned out a lot better than that. All of the judges voted for all of the resolutions, including all of the Western judges, including the American judge. And basically Israel was pretty much isolated. Israel voted for itself, and then Uganda voted with Israel. Uganda is extremely dependent on Israel for infrastructure development and stuff like that. So I'm sure there was a tremendous political pressure there. But so it did turn out a lot better than I would have expected. However, the decision itself does not actually say at this point that Israel is engaged in genocide. It just simply says, well, there's cause for concern, and Israel needs to take these steps to ensure they're not doing genocide, and then they need to come back in a few years and explain, why they're not doing genocide. And so it's in that sense, the court is somewhat toothless. And then, of course, if there were to be a finding that Israel's engaged in genocide, then it would go. I believe the next step is it goes in front of the Security Council, and then, of course, 3 of the 5 countries on the Security Council are as far as the permanent members are part of NATO, and you also have Russia and China. And an issue that Norman Finkelstein raised that I thought was interesting is that Russia is being accused of genocide in Ukraine, and then China is being accused of genocide in the Uyghur territory. So it may be that they're not necessarily that fond of accusing other nations of genocide when those charges could be brought against them as well. So that's an issue. But it seems though that Israel did a lot worse than I thought they were. The courts were much less sympathetic to Israel. But the thing is, though, even if there's no real power of enforcement, if an international body like the UN or like the ICJ were to actually declare Israel to be guilty of genocide, that would have the effect of relegating Israel to pariah state status. And that would in turn put a tremendous pressure on different countries to do things like impose trade sanctions or simply refuse to engage in trade relations. The best example of that from the past is what happened with the former apartheid regime in South Africa. When apartheid was still in place, there was a worldwide movement to pressure governments to impose sanctions or embargoes, as well as cultural boycotts. Like there was a big movement among entertainers. You don't play South Africa, you don't tour South Africa. Bands would boycott South Africa, celebrities, and all of that. And the sum total effect of this is that it made South Africa into an international pariah state. And that was extremely damaging to South Africa's international standing as far as their economic consequences and stuff like that. It also started causing the state to have of South Africa to start losing legitimacy internally. Even among the white ruling class, they started thinking, well, we've got to change this. This is more trouble than it's worth. So I think that in the long run, something like what's being done at the ICJ could have a similar effect on Israel. Although Israel is pretty brazen, it's if you listen to the comments coming from Israel's top leaders, it's straight out of the Third Reich. It's like this guy Yoav Gallant, the head of their defense force. He's the new Hermann Goering, and this guy Ben Gvir, he sounds like Heinrich Himmler or something. So they're pretty far gone. So I wonder if there's ever going to be any kind of real reform in Israel and Palestine. I suspect it may be a situation where Israel just overreaches to the point of collapse. Because the one thing about Israel is that their internal society is very fragmented before you even get to the Palestinian conflict. Within Israel itself, they have the same culture war America does, only on steroids. Benjamin Netanyahu is extremely unpopular. You have extreme polarization between the far right religious parties who are basically like Jewish ISIS or something like that, and then their equivalent of the Blue Tribe or whatever, the very pro-Western side, and not to mention the ethnic conflict. You have, and again, before you even get to the Palestinian issue, you have the Israel's elite, their ruling class are mostly Ashkenazis, they're European Jews,
versus the actual like blood, closer to it.
Yeah, and then their working class tend to be more Middle Eastern Jews. They're Jewish working class, and then they also have a lot of migrants that they're dependent on. Like the Ethiopians, and they're treated very badly as black people. Then they have a lot of migrant workers from East Asia, Thailand, the Philippines, and places like that. In fact, some of the hostages that were taken on October 7th, some of those were actually Thai migrant workers. Some people are saying, what are Thai people doing in Israel? Like, well, they're dependent on migrant labor, just like a lot of the other Middle Eastern countries in the same way. They import a lot of East Asian migrant workers. So Israel's extremely unstable internally. And so, I think it's very likely that Israel is probably just going to fragment eventually. Probably a possibility is what happened to Lebanon. Like Lebanon just totally fell apart in the 1970s. In fact, I remember back then on the news all the time, you used to always hear about the war in Lebanon. Well, in Lebanon today, the Christians massacred some Muslims, and Muslims massacred some Christians, and on and on and on. And they fought a pretty bloody civil war with dozens of different factions for probably about 15 or 20 years before they actually created a settlement and have to create the system they have now. And Israel may very well go in the same direction. It may just be a very lengthy civil war.
And here's the other half of it is that, like, okay, pariah states. Maybe. The U.S. is a pariah state. Nobody fucking likes the hegemony. Fucking Saudi Arabia is part of their hegemony, and it's a pariah state. Fucking, like, literally Biden, part of the reason that he fucking campaigned the way he did the last time was he's like, I'm going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state. And then what does he do? He sells them arms. He continues to work with them. He goes and has meetings where he's like greasing their palms. He's fucking it doesn't matter. None of this matters. It doesn't change the fact that international relations is run by psychotic fuckers who do not give a shit if they're like, oh yeah, hey, your guy's a war criminal. Yeah, my aunt's a war criminal. Who fucking cares? It doesn't matter. Like, none of this matters because these people have been running this shit this way for the only purpose of the ICJ is so that countries can like have this illusion of international cooperation. But if the US isn't involved and it's the biggest international player, that means the international shit doesn't mean garbage. It's sort of like how in China, they've got all these economic controls and shit, but if you go to certain casinos, you can get away with whatever you want. The fact that, like, in America, they've got their economic controls, but if you use XMR, you can dodge them. If there's all these pressure release mechanisms, then it doesn't matter what international pressure is put on them, they'll use one of them. And like, that's the purpose really of all of these things is it's designed to make sure that the system can continue operating the way that it always has. None of this fucking matters. Like the ICJ, what are they going to do to Israel? Are they going to take their money so that Israel can demand more money from the US in terms of foreign aid to keep afloat? Are they going to disarm them so that Israel and the U.S. are now at the attack of like the international justice system? That's not going to happen. Nobody's going to blink there. So like all these countries that are a part of these hegemonies, they're all parts of like collections and gangs of clusterfucks of pariah states. Nobody gives a shit. So it's like when this comes down to brass tacks, we are dealing with evil globalists on a, fucking millennia old bent of old money power bullshit. And the new shit is just an extension of the old shit with rebranding. The petrodollar is just the newest form of usury. It doesn't matter. None of this matters. They don't care. They don't give a fuck. They're going to keep on oppressing people no matter what. And Israel is a vassal state of Western Empire, and Western Empire isn't a part of the ICJ. So as long as Western Empire isn't a part of the ICJ and Israel's a vassal state of that, Ukraine is a vassal state of that, like there's a reason Ukraine didn't sign that pledge. Ukraine and the US were the only two countries recently that did not sign that pledge against Nazism. It's because they don't care about Nazis. They help the Nazis. They love
That's
them.
because Nazis run those countries.
Yes. Fuck these people. They're bad anyway. They should all be pariahs. We should all. I'm not going to say anything more because I'm about to say things that would get this channel gone. I'm not going to say what I want to happen to these governments. I don't want anything bad to happen to these governments.
Yeah, we like them. They're our favorite mafia with a flag.
Fucking garbage. I hate this. Like, it's not real. It's not. This is all just pageantry.
I do
until we get in the streets, until we take direct fucking action, we're not going to get anywhere. It doesn't matter. None of this matters.
I'm actually curious with what Keith said. So, because like my dad explained the Lebanon conflict to me when I was younger. So, do you see something? I'm sure you're familiar with because you mentioned in the group Hezbollah. Not endorsing or saying good or bad or anything, but do you see if certain parts of, I guess, Israel or wherever, or who knows, even parts of Palestine fragment, do you see groups like that emerging? Do you see Aristan being a possibility, or some kind of Confederate state?
Yeah, well, as far as the Hezbollah model, yeah, that's a non-state actors that tend to dominate in fourth generation warfare. So yeah, it's entirely possible that the Israel and Palestine, that region could largely become dominated by these kind of non-state actors like Hezbollah in the future. Well, Hamas is something like that already, and you have Jewish paramilitaries that are similar as well. Now that's not an optimal situation, but yeah, you could certainly see that happen. As far as the greater Israel becoming like Israeltine, I think for that to work, you'd probably have to have international involvement. You'd have to have a group of international negotiators working with the different factions, trying to put that together. That's kind of what happened in Lebanon to some degree. Like in Lebanon's post-war system is what they call a consociational system, or sometimes it's called a confessional system, which means that every faction, every ethnic and religious cultural faction is guaranteed a certain number of seats in parliament and a certain number of seats in the cabinet and stuff like that. And even then, Hezbollah, which is a non-state actor, is really the national defense forces of Lebanon. And I think a future, post-Zionist Israel or whatever, or Israel Palestine, would probably have to be something kind of like the Swiss system, where local enclaves of different ethnic and religious groups are largely self-managed. At the national level, something like the consociational system, where you have guaranteed numbers of Jews and Muslims and Christians or Arabs or whatever, and having proportional representation. Because if you had just like raw majoritarianism, like a mass democracy, then it's just going to be whoever has 51% at the time. And right now they're split about down the middle. I think Arabs in Greater Israel have a slight majority now. So yeah, I mean it's a really messy situation. It's probably going to be get even worse before there's any real improvement there.
It's got to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
We're fucked.
Well, it's already pretty bad. I mean,
well, actually, I was going to say, do you see the Likud party, Netanyahu's party, actually surviving this? Because that, at least if you get rid of that, that'd be like, okay, fine.
I think it's a good possibility they won't, because he is just so unpopular with the Israelis. I think his approval rating is something like 8% in Israel now, which is practically unheard of when you have a country that's in a state of war. Like usually wartime presidents are popular in whatever country, irrespective of what the war is about or whatever. Netanyahu was extremely unpopular. In fact, a lot of Israelis blame him for October 7th. They say he was sleeping on the job or whatever. I think in the long run, it's very unlikely that his party is going to survive. Also, Netanyahu himself is actually facing criminal charges too. In fact, one reason I think he wants to prolong the war is so he can avoid going to jail.
And that's the thing. Okay, so I keep saying this to people, like they knew it was coming. They had the best intelligence. They already knew it was coming. They had already been informed. $6 billion suddenly gets unfrozen to Iran. Iran suddenly has slush fund money for Hamas. Hamas does the attack. They knew it was coming. They let it happen. They have the most advanced, sophisticated bullshit in the region, and suddenly it's allowed. And all of this right after they were starting to complain about low weapons stockpiles because they'd been helping fund the proxy war in Ukraine with all these weapons that come from America's stockpile. And damn it, now we need more weapons for our stockpile because the mean old Hamas motherfuckers came over here. And, oh, by the way, at the same time, you can't protest. You can't do the same protests you were doing of Netanyahu because guess what? We're at war now, motherfuckers. I'm enacting war powers. That's convenient! Anyway,
Yes.
Go ahead. Sorry, I just had to say that. Yeah, it's fucking infuriating how people don't connect the fucking dots. Anyway, go ahead, Keith. Sorry, Keith.
I'm as to what degree the Israelis had the advanced knowledge of October 7th. I'm not sure. There's evidence.
They admit to it.
Well, the Egyptians had actually told the Israelis that we think something's going to happen soon, so they had forewarning. Whether the question is, did they actually know it was going to happen and say, "Hey, just let it happen. It'll work to our advantage if we do." Or was it just simply, well, whatever? They just didn't take it seriously. There's still questions like that about 9/11. So it's
not in my mind. There's no question in my mind. That's fucking an inside job. I don't give a shit. Fuck them.
But I do have. I'm curious about a couple of things and then I wrap it up. But do you see any? Because I wasn't familiar with him. My dad kind of has a mixed opinion on him, but you see, and from what I've read, I can't prove any of this stuff, but I guess a cabinet member of Netanyahu's actually said he coordinated getting rid of Yitzhak Rabin. Do you see any figures like that because they're just tired because they don't want their economy to collapse? Like, look, I don't particularly like our neighbors, but can we not have prolonged conflict for economic reasons? And do you see any other actors getting involved like Turkey or I know the Houthis are involved in stuff. I do see more actors saying they'll do something. I think it's interesting to see what's going on in a very frightening way. So,
well, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Likudnik. It's widely thought that Benjamin Netanyahu actually orchestrated the assassination. And I think for anything to improve in Israel, the Likud definitely has to go. There are also other parties aligned with Likud that they're basically like a Jewish version of ISIS. And those need to go as well. But yeah, that's what it will take, I think, on Israel's part is that they'll need to have leaders or groups of people who say, look, this just doesn't worth the cost. It's like we just can't keep doing that. That was one of the things that brought about some initial reforms in the Soviet Union when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power and said, look, we can't continue this way. That's probably what it's going to take there as far as leadership. What was the second part of your question?
So I'm not a military expert by any means, and me and my other co-hosts, of two other co-hosts who have deliberated that, for lack of a better understanding of military knowledge, because obviously I'm an ANCAP, and the closest I'll ever get to a military is probably like the Boog or the Black Bloc or Sons of Liberty or something, which I still think could win. But I listened to Colonel Douglas Macgregor to get another perspective, maybe from a statist perspective, but still someone who's a rational actor, who's not completely crazy on imperialism like some of the neocons. And what he said is that if this keeps going too far, somebody like Erdogan will say, like, look, and I know this for a fact. I know Colonel Douglas McGregor's wrong. There are people in Egypt who are really furious now. Like, we got to do something. Like, when we're doing something, there's a lot of Arab countries, just because their leaders are saying that their populations are pissed off. Now, if it goes too far, from your perspective, Colonel Douglas McGregor says yes. Sisi considering.
Yeah, a lot of these dissident military commentators have made the same argument. Dan Davis, Scott Ritter, people like that. The issue there is that in a lot of the Arab countries and a lot of the general Muslim countries, those governments in those countries are under extreme popular pressure to take action over what's happening in Gaza. The issue is that the governments in those countries, they don't want to risk getting into a wider regional war because they know they're not going to do very well. Probably even bigger than that is the fact that the United States pays a lot of those governments to pretend to be friendly to Israel, or at least not get in direct conflict with Israel. Egypt is probably the prime example, Saudi Arabia as well. But the issue is if the public pressure in those countries gets so strong that to maintain legitimacy, maintain credibility, perhaps not even be overthrown, like what happened to Hosni Mubarak, for example, they may experience pressure to actually take action, and who knows where it would start. But if one major country in the Middle East started taking action against Israel over Gaza, the others would feel pressure to join in. For instance, Erdogan, I think, wants to position himself as the de facto leader of the Muslim world. I think that's what he's really going for as far as his own ambitions. But to have any kind of credibility, he's got to be seen as the guy that's really leading the charge as far as coming to the aid of the Palestinians. Now, so far, it's only been talk. But the further this goes, the more pressure he's going to be under. Interestingly, the Middle Eastern politics right now is really split into three major blocks. You have the Sunni bloc, which is primarily the Gulf states. It's Saudi Arabia and its allies. The UAE, for example, Oman. Well, the Omanis are Ibadis; they're not Sunnis, but it's still they're part of that Gulf alliance. So that's one faction. Then you have the predominantly Shia bloc, which is Iran and the Syrians. With the Assads are Alawites, but you get my point. The Shia-led bloc, and then you also have the groups that are derivative of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is and then state-wise you have Qatar, and then you also have Turkey. So you have this Turkey-Qatari axis, and then the Gulf axis, and then the Shia axis. And these are all rivals as to who's going to be dominant in the region. And if one takes action against Israel, the others are going to feel tremendous pressure to join in because they're going to want to assert themselves as, no, we're the dominant power in the Islamic world. Not this, not Erdogan. For example, if the axis of resistance continues to escalate their support for the Palestinians, really right now it's the Houthis, maybe the Hezbollah to some degree, Iran on a more rhetorical level. But if they were to escalate their involvement, the Arab Sunni states and the Turks would both have a great deal of pressure to be involved in that as well and try to one up their rivals among the Islamic populations in the region. So then that could be a significant escalation. And the longer this goes on, the more pressure there's going to be.
Okay. And Noah or Jeremy or anything, and it's almost 2 hours, so definitely we'll wrap it up.
I barely got to talk at all in this stream. That's why I kept leaving.
Yeah, sorry, man. Let Noah get your thoughts at Texas, the ICJ, all that stuff. Apologize, Keith. I know I said an hour, but the conversation was that good.
It happens all the time.
All right. Keith Preston was really cooking. So yeah, but Texas, I'm still. I don't want to say I'm anticipating a civil war, but I'm just curious to see what has happened, what will happen, because nothing this spicy has happened since 9/11, so to speak, or maybe the recession of 2008. And the ICJ, I don't really think anything's going to come out of it because, like Jeremy said, the Western Bloc isn't part of the ICJ, and they're the biggest supporters of Israel.
A big
And
issue there is going to be what pressure the Western governments experience from their own populations to
right,
take action over Palestine. You know, the Biden administration is worried about it because they're worried that they're going to lose the Arab American and Muslim American and vote and other populations that are generally sympathetic to Palestine. They're actually worried that's going to cost them the election. So it is an issue for them.
Good. I hope it does. And I'll tell you this, just out of the thing, I got Muslim people because I go to the masjid, everything. They're like, Kareem, you're Muslim, you're Egyptian. Are you voting Democrat? And I'm like, no, I'm a libertarian. They're like, what's that? And now I'm really going to push it very hard on them. Like, I'm not going to be very nice to like my coworkers or the riding with Biden or even the Trump people anymore.
right.
Even the classical liberals, I'm kind of, it's like gloves off. You're either anarchist or not. Noah also proposed to me a pretty good idea. I'll just throw this out there and see what you think. Like Jeff Berwick has his conference in Arcopoco, but that's mainly anarcho-capitalists. And then there's people probably who have confidence for ANCOMs and syndicalists. But I see a big problem with all this, other than maybe Jeff Berwick, you know, I don't know his personal practices. But there's no convention, like you're saying, world churches. There's no convention that has everybody from all spectrums coming together.
Right.
I thought that was insightful. If you want to talk about your
Plus,
ideas.
it seems like Anarchapulco is shifting away from anarchism and is focusing more towards on the absurd, like the flat Earth, New Age spirituality. I think that was always a part of it.
It was. I went to the first couple of Anarchapulcos in 2015 and 2016. In fact, I was a speaker there. And yeah, right from the start, it always struck me as less about anarchism and more about Bitcoin, more about like New Age spirituality, more about drugs,
Right.
more about conspiracy theories. Like a lot, like I would talk to people there and ask them, like, well, how long have you been an anarchist? And they say, oh, I got into it about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, something like that. And when I tell them that at the time I'd been interested in anarchism for like 30 years, they're like, what? You know, and I'm like, yeah. And then I'd ask them, you know, if you ever read Bakunin, you ever read Pierre Joseph Proudhon, you ever read Malatesta? I never heard of any of those guys. You know, so it's,
I have a joke about Anarchapulco.
yeah.
Imagine if Alan Watts, Timothy Leary spoke there, or Tool played there, because they incorporated a lot of DMT-inspired psychedelic art covers. You know what I'm trying to say? I sound
Yeah.
like Biden with my incoherent ass thoughts.
Yeah, a lot of the people I met there were really into stuff like Alex Jones and David Icke, and you know some of the like
David Icke. I don't trust David Icke at all. He's an insane lunatic, but he's not an anti-Semite. He's not using lizard people or reptilian humanoids as a dog whistle for Jewish power or whatever. He legitimately believes they come from Alpha Draconis. And I'm sick of talking to leftists who think that he's just an anti-Semite and that he's not a legitimately insane person. Though he does get some things right. But most of the shit he talks about is New Age conspirituality.
You know, here's the thing, though. First off, I like a lot of what he has to say. He
Right.
has some good points in a variety of places. I disagree about the reptilians, but let me be absolutely clear. If you can believe in a talking snake, you can believe in a reptile that is an overlord that carries skin. If you can
Right.
believe in in karma and reincarnation, reptilians aren't too far off. Like every world religion is like on a similar level to believing that in terms of believability. So the idea that somebody is insane for believing that and not for believing that somebody turned water to wine or whatever, I think it's just I'm not gonna call any of these people insane. I think they genuinely believe it, and I don't think that makes them insane. What I will say is that I don't believe that part of it. I can take the good and leave the bad.
That's what I do, but
yeah.
I don't know.
One issue with the idea of having an Anarchapulco like thing only for all the different types of anarchists is that all the different types all hate each other. So they would probably
Exactly.
they would all probably refuse to show up if any of the others were there. And that's not new among anarchists. Back in I guess the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was an effort to put together an anarchist unity conference among American anarchists as they were back then. And they wanted to invite Benjamin Tucker, an individualist, and they also wanted to invite Johann Most, an anarcho-communist. And both of those guys refused to attend on the grounds that the other guy was invited. So neither one of them actually went.
Did they consider inviting Emma Goldman?
I'm sure they would have, because she was such a prominent figure in anarchism. She would have went. She's one of those that would have went. But I think
and had that scowl on her face. I love that look. It's just like, I'm pissed to be here anywhere I am.
Who are you talking about? Me?
Emma Goldman.
No, Emma.
No.
That's
like if you look at any picture of Emma Goldman, she just looks like, yeah, I'm fucking here. Fuck you.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Emma Goldman was a friend of Magus Hirschfeld, who the Nazis demonize. Oh, he's the big bad Jew who pushes transgenderism on the youth. I was called a nonce for saying that he did nothing wrong for opening the first transgender clinic. There's no documented proof he diddled kids, and he even said that pedophiles are evil.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how about this? I'll challenge that. Okay, that may have failed in the past, but we got the internet now. I emailed John Zerzan. I said I was an ANCAP at the time, and he came on. And Jeremy was on there too. And I have agorist friends, and I have ego people like ANCOM.
Right.
EcoCom.
Hey, I have some suggestion for guests. Some of you aren't going to like the guests. All right, ego communist, Rada. I don't know how you pronounce his Facebook name. I'll have to look it up.
How about this? We'll invite a bunch of them at the same time too. Like I'll invite Zerzan, an ANCOM, a syndicalist, and Keith and Jeremy and an ANCAP.
Justin Padini. I'm joking. I know him and Jeremy would start talking shit.
That'll be good. I'll tell you who. How about my friend Lizard Jesus, Mike?
Oh, we should get the Watchman State back on, by the way.
Yeah, Watchman. John Zerzan. How about this? I'll invite John Zerzan, an EgoCom that I'm friends with, an ANCAP, and a mutualist, and I bet you they'll all show up. How about that, Keith?
Well, yeah, Keith, that would be great if you could make it work. Yeah, I'd like to see more of that. It's, there's so many other points of types of anarchism out there. Like, are you familiar with black anarchism? Like Lorenzo Gamboa Irvin and Ashanti
I know him.
Alston.
Not personally, but I've read a synopsis of his life story.
Yeah, there's some academic anarchists that are interesting. Like, are you familiar with Ruth Kenna or Sophie Scott Brown? They're basically academics. Like, I'm not sure what their actual field is. I think.
Are there any other anarchist YouTubers you could invite, such as Re-Education or what's her name? I can't think of it.
I would love to invite Re-Education. Kai is really cool, even though Kai, is a syndicalist who was against ANCAPs and said, it's funny enough, it seems syndicalists and ANCAPs fight each other. And then I'm like, hey, anarcho-primitivists. They're like, oh, those people, oh my God, they're the worst thing ever. I'm like,
well, Zoe Baker, is that her name?
I don't know. But if these people are on X, I can invite groups of them, not too many, because obviously we don't want like 10 people talking, but like
Right.
I could get
You're talking about organizing some kind of online event. This isn't going to be in like Meat Space, right? This like
well, maybe not in my lifetime, but maybe eventually.
Well, but like it should start in online and then it could potentially move to Meat Space. Like this is only ever gonna get popular if we can, like, people meet this kind of person online. They don't oftentimes, like, I'm an asshole. I'll just run into a store and be like, yeah, I'm an anarchist conspiracy theorist who wants to talk about how the government are cunts. But like, not everybody is like that. And most people are going to keep their views to themselves, especially since they've been told this isn't how you operate in polite society. And so, a lot of the time they'll just keep their fuckhole shut. Like, I think a lot of the time people need to start opening themselves up, but like they're not gonna do that. Like, so I think online is a good way to start this sort of thing, and then we could move it to Meat Space once that happens. And also, if people could just agree, because like today, I was doing what I was already planning on doing, and Keith brought it up as well in the private chat, where if like they just, when the other person is talking, their mic is off. I did that for most of the time today. So like, I think if people could just agree to that instead of doing what's been done in the past where they just start talking over each other on purpose, that would probably be a way that we could do it. I don't see a problem with having like a huge amount of people on, as long as they're actually willing to not stick their cock in each other's ears.
I've been on webinars that I have some friends who belong to the Green Party, and they do these online webinars that I've attended and been on some of their panels. And they actually have a very sophisticated system where they have hundreds of people present. They'll have a moderator, and then they'll have a group of presenters, like maybe 5 or 6 people that present. And then people can sign up in advance to either make a statement or ask questions. And then they have someone monitoring the chat, and you can put questions in the chat, and then you can ask that of the speakers. So it's a very interactive system involving a fairly large number of people. And they have they have like a special link they can send out to people who are going to ask the questions and all of that. That's beyond the major link for the webinar. I'll have to ask them more about how they do that technically, because it's a system that seems to work really well. I was on a panel with Jill Stein in one of their presentations. It was pretty interesting.
That's awesome. Yeah, I met her at the protest, Rage Against the War Machine. But with that, we're over 2 hours.
Oh,
so
wait. I got something to say about that phony protest. Majority of them were in favor of Russian imperialism, therefore defeating the purpose of raging against the war machine. The only war machine they're raging against is the Western version, not the Eurasian version.
Yeah, same with LaRouche's Humanity for Peace. Go ahead.
If you want to be truly anti-war, you have to oppose border statist wars 100%, not just be against U.S. aid to Ukraine, which is a noble cause on its own. But what was Jeremy mentioned some National Guard guy who tried to shoot BLM protesters. I think I was friends with him back on Facebook back in the day. I'm trying to think of his name.
And it's I think it's Daniel Perry, if I remember correctly. I got the name wrong.
I think
Shandon Simpson was his name. Shandon Simpson was the he's going on the patriotic socialism grift currently, but he's still a fascist through and through.
And well, just because I got the name wrong earlier, and I recognized that almost immediately, because like I got to correct the record. Garrett Foster was the one murdered, not the person who did the murder. Garrett Foster got in, like, he just had a gun on him, and he like was getting in between his disabled girlfriend and this fucking psycho who like named Daniel Perry, who like gunned him down after driving his car into a crowd of protesters, after having texted around saying, I'm going to do that. So for any of you who know Garrett Foster, that was not an intentional flub, is to, but like just correcting that record.
Yeah, if Black Bloc and Boog Boys can get along, so can the other factions and schools of anarchy.
Yeah, one thing about the Rage Against the War Machine, and also one of you mentioned Humanity for Peace. The groups involved in that were largely tanky-oriented groups, which tend to
tanky libertarian unity.
Yeah, they tend to be pro-Russian or pro-Eastern. It's like that's a real problem too among self-identified anarchists, well, radicals generally, because there's two different ways people tend to go. Like you have these folks who say, well, Western imperialism are the bad guys, so that must mean the Eastern powers are all of the good guys. Then that's like the tanky position, and some libertarians have that position. And then you've got the flip side of that. You have people who say, no, Russia's bad guys. They invaded Ukraine, or China's bad guys. They've got this massive surveillance state. So they end up taking views on international relations that sound almost like neoliberals or something like that. It's like that guy Vaush. I think he once called himself an anarcho-NATOist.
Vaush is a little cow for sure.
But like at the same time, he's closer to reality than a lot of other people in that regard. I just don't like his views on child porn and all that sort of shit. But like ultimately, when we come to like, it's true. Like China is not a good country. Like, and his guest that he had on, Vaush, that talked about Chinese imperialism, that was a good interview. Even though I don't like Vaush, I sat and listened to the whole thing because it's good to hear from a Chinese perspective on Chinese totalitarianism. Like everybody who thinks China's who jacks off to pictures of Xi, they should like look at that interview and they should actually give it a stern listen and listen to the fact that China isn't some uniparty and that there are individuals there who don't like it and have good reasons to. Like these people are brainwashed in a lot of ways, propagandized in the same way that they complain about the West. Like, okay, here's an example. Woo! I went down a rabbit hole last night. I was supposed to be trying to get to sleep, but this caught me off guard and fucked me up. There's a piano guy. I don't remember his name right now, but recently, within the past week, he was doing a live stream in a British mall. And this guy in this live stream in a British mall where he would routinely go there and try to play the piano and entertain people. He's not a bad person as far as I can tell. He went there to do the same shit that he regularly did. And what happened? He got approached by a group of Chinese people saying that that he needs to stop filming because they have image rights. And one of these people might have been armed and acting as security and shit like that. And these people came in and tried to say that you couldn't film here because they were walking through the territory. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because that's what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with like hyper libertarians in that regard. We're not dealing with fucking awesome forces for liberty. We're dealing with people who get used to that culture and then bring it over to where they are. Like some of them aren't. There are a lot of more liberty leaning people over there, but those people want out or they want it to change. They don't like it there. That's not a hub for So all these motherfuckers who want to act like BRICS is the heroes are fucking dumb. I hate them. They're compromised internally.
Okay. Speaking of the BRICS, there was an interesting article on the Winter Oak website. Are you familiar with that?
No.
I just put the article in the chat here, but Winter Oak is a green anarchist website. But the guy that edits it, his name is Paul something. But anyway, he's talking about the BRICS, and he's talking about how transnational elites have their hands in the BRICS as well as in the West.
Yes.
One of my main areas of interest is that how we have transnational elites that transcend the boundaries of individual countries, including countries that are formally enemies with each other, like America and Russia or whatever. And some of these transnational elites have their hands in everything. They have their hands in different countries and different financial institutions, including the BRICS. And Paul, in this article here, he explains that he explains the history of the these international elites from with their relationship with Brazil, with Russia, with China, with India, saying it's not like these countries, these Eastern countries, are necessarily anti-imperialist as much as they're more counter-imperialist. They want an imperialism of their own, or sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes they just want a bigger piece of the pie. They just want a bigger piece of the globalist pie. Like that's one of the critiques he advances of people like Alexander Dugin. Like he says, is Alexander Dugin really an anti-globalist, or does he just want Russia to have a bigger part of the global system? Well, it's obviously the latter. Like Dugin would probably be fine with globalism if it was Russia rather than America that was at the top of the pyramid. Yeah.
And
So
like, that's the real problem with this, is that people get fucking blind spots. I hate it so much. Also, the guy's name is Brendan Kavanaugh on YouTube. He's got like 2.38 million subscribers. Dr. K Boogie Woogie. He plays piano. And Watchman State in comments says, I saw this. One of them was a party member and diplomat too. They covered it on a podcast of the Lotus Eaters extensively. I don't know who that is, but it sounds familiar. But yeah, these people are imperialists. They never. So when people are acting like, oh yeah, we're against imperialism, that's why we support. No, you don't, you fuck nugget. Shut the fuck up. I hate these people so much.
Well, I tend to look at it like, when they're right, they're right. When they're wrong, they're wrong. Like when it comes to the pro-Palestine protest, I mean, you've seen a lot of tankies involved in that. You've seen a lot of, quote unquote, woke people involved in that, including people I would disagree with on many other issues, like being pro-Russian or something like that. But, when they're right, they're right. It's just like I told someone recently, like when guys like Putin and Erdogan and Z come out and say, well, what's going on in Gaza is genocide. Okay, that's one of those broken clock twice a day moments. They may be wrong the other 99% of the time, but when they get that one thing right, okay, it is what it is.
Yep. Yeah, and when they do get it wrong, they're trying to fuck kids like Scott Ritter. So
Yeah. Well, as an analyst, I think he's really interesting. But yeah, there's some shady stuff in his background.
So with that being said, though, I'm going to invite multiple different anarchists on because this is getting wild. I want to thank my guest, Noah, definitely, for bringing that idea up. Insanity is free from Anarch Unity. Go check us out. And AgNexus, and also the amazing Keith Preston from Attack the System. This is your host, Kareem, the Essential Libertarians, giving you the tools for self-governance. We'll catch you next time, hopefully with a bunch of anarchists.